It was the kind of sunny, crisp Florida afternoon that makes the paint on a stock car look like it's actually glowing. February 18th, 2001, the Daytona 500. We were on the final lap, turn 3, and the entire world was watching a master at work. Dale Earnhardt, the man in the black number 3 Goodwrench Chevrolet, was doing what he did better than anyone else in the history of the sport. He was manipulating the air, controlling the pack, and protecting his own. He was running third, blocking the field so his son, Dale Jr., and his longtime friend, Michael Waltrip, could run away with the win. It was supposed to be the perfect ending. The Intimidator, the toughest man to ever wrestle a steering wheel, finally softening just enough to play the proud father. But here's the thing about auto racing that we often forget in the glamour of the broadcast. Physics doesn't care about narratives. Physics doesn't care about legends. In turn 4, with the checkered flag in sight, contact was made. The number 3 car turned right, shot up the banking, and hit the concrete wall. It didn't look like a catastrophe. It looked like a hard hit, sure, but we had seen Earnhardt tumble down the backstretch at Talladega. We had seen him flip at Daytona before. We had seen him walk away from crashes that looked like they should have left nothing but scrap metal. This one, it looked routine. The car stayed mostly intact. It slid down the track, came to a rest on the infield grass, and the cameras cut away to the celebration. Michael Waltrip had won. The plan had worked. This is legacy motoring, and I spend way too much time thinking about the engineering behind automotive tragedies. If you're someone who wants to understand not just what happened, but the hidden mechanical failures and physics that changed racing forever, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. Now, you might be thinking, I've heard this story 1,000 times, and you probably have. But here's what most people don't realize. The death of Dale Earnhardt wasn't just a racing accident. It was the inevitable mathematical conclusion of a culture that had ignored basic biomechanics for 50 years. It was a failure of imagination as much as it was a failure of engineering. To understand why he died in a crash that looks so survivable, we have to peel back the layers of what was actually happening inside that cockpit at the microscopic level. And we have to look at the specific, stubborn psychology that kept a life-saving device sitting on a shelf while the greatest driver in American history bled out internally. Let's go back to that moment of impact. When the number 3 car hit the wall, it was traveling at approximately 160 miles per hour. The angle of impact was roughly 55 to 59 degrees. Now, in the world of crash dynamics, angles are everything. If you hit a wall straight on, 90 degrees, you get the maximum transfer of energy. The car stops instantly, and all that kinetic energy has to go somewhere. Usually it goes into the chassis and then into the driver. If you hit a wall at a shallow angle, say 20 degrees, you scrub off the speed. The car slides along the wall. The friction slows you down over hundreds of feet, and the G-forces remain manageable. Earnhardt hit at that deadly intermediate angle. It was steep enough that the car stopped violently fast, but glancing enough that the car spun. The data recorders later showed that the car experienced a change in velocity, or delta V, of about 42 to 44 miles per hour in roughly 80 milliseconds. To put that in perspective, blink your eyes. That takes about 300 to 400 milliseconds. The fatal forces in that crash happened 4 times faster than you can blink. Inside the car, a brutal sequence of events was taking place. Dale was wearing an open-faced helmet. He was wearing a standard 5-point safety harness, but he was not wearing a head and neck support device, or hands. When the car struck the concrete, the chassis stopped. The C, bolted to the chassis, stopped. The harness, pulled tight across Dale's chest and hips, stopped his torso. But his head? His head was a 15-pound object, helmet included, traveling at 160 miles per hour that suddenly wanted to keep going. Here is where it gets really interesting, and honestly quite terrifying. Newton's first law of motion states that an object in motion stays in motion unless acted upon by an outside force. The outside force that stopped Dale Earnhardt's head wasn't a specialized tether or an airbag. It was his own neck, specifically the ligaments and bones connecting the base of his skull to his spine. When the torso stops and the head keeps moving forward, the neck acts like a whip. This is called the whip mechanism. The head snaps forward with tremendous violence, stretching the neck beyond its physiological limit. In that split second, the force required to stop his head was estimated to be equivalent to lifting 1,000 pounds with just your neck muscles. Obviously, that is impossible. The result is a basilar skull fracture. It's a clean break at the base of the cranium, often severing the brainstem or the major arteries that feed the brain. It is catastrophic. It is almost instant. And in 2001, it was the dirty little secret of motorsport. Look, we have to talk about the culture of 2001, because without that context, the engineering doesn't make sense. You have to understand that NASCAR at the turn of the millennium was experiencing growing pains. It was moving from a regional southern sport to a national powerhouse, but the mindset in the garage was still very much rooted in the 1970s. The prevailing wisdom was that safety was a matter of toughness. If you felt unsafe, you lifted off the gas. If you got hurt, you walked it off. There was a genuine, albeit misguided belief among drivers that being strapped in too tight was dangerous. They feared fire. They feared being trapped in a burning car more than they feared the impact itself. This fear dated back to the 60s and 70s, when fuel cells were prone to rupturing. Dale Earnhardt himself was famous for wearing his seatbelts loose. He wanted to be able to move around in the car, to lean forward, to feel the machine. He wore an open-faced helmet because he wanted to see the air, to feel the draft, to see his mirrors without obstruction. He called the hands device a noose. He said he'd never wear one. But here is the tragedy of that mindset. By 2001, the cars had become too rigid. In the pursuit of speed and chassis stiffness, which makes a car handle better, teams had built tanks. These cars were incredibly strong. They didn't crumple, and that sounds good, right? You want a strong car. Well, not exactly. In a crash, you want the car to die so the driver can live. You want the metal to bend, fold, and crush, because every inch of metal that crumples is absorbing energy that would otherwise go into your body. The 2001 Chevrolet Monte Carlo was a brick. When it hit that wall, it didn't give. It transferred all that violence directly to the pilot. So the sun sets on Daytona. The ambulances leave. The realization spreads through the garage. And suddenly, the sport is faced with a crisis that threatens to destroy it. This wasn't just a driver. This was the driver. And he was killed not by a freak accident, but by a known preventable mechanism of injury that biomechanical engineers had been screaming about for 10 years. This brings us to the most uncomfortable question of all, one that people were afraid to ask in the days following the funeral. If the solution existed, why wasn't it mandatory? Why did it take the death of a titan to force a change that should have happened years earlier? To answer that, we have to look at a man named Dr. Robert Hubbard, a biomechanical engineer who was treated like a nuisance by the racing establishment, and how his invention, a simple carbon fiber collar, became the most important piece of safety equipment since the seatbelt. But before we get to the redemption arc, we have to understand the depth of the resistance he faced. Dr. Robert Hubbard was a biomechanical engineer at Michigan State University, and honestly, he was the last guy you'd expect to change the face of high-speed racing. He didn't look like a racer. He looked like a professor. But he had a brother-in-law named Jim Downing who raced sports cars in IMSA, and they shared a concern that was becoming harder to ignore. They noticed that drivers were surviving the initial impacts of crashes. The fire didn't get them, the crushing metal didn't get them, but they were dying instantly from what looked like nothing. The car would spin, thump a wall, and the driver would be gone. Hubbard realized that while we had strapped the body down tight, we had left the head completely free to act as a pendulum. So in the mid-1980s, Hubbard developed the prototype. And look, if you look at photos of the early hands device, it was huge. It was this massive fiberglass yoke that looked like something out of a bad sci-fi movie. It was cumbersome. It required a specific helmet. It was hard to get in and out of the car. When Downing started wearing it, people laughed. They called it the device. Not in a cool way, but in a what is that thing on your neck way. Drivers are creatures of habit. They are control freaks. Anything that restricts their movement, anything that limits their peripheral vision, is seen as a threat to their performance. They believe that seeing a crash coming and being able to react was safer than being strapped into a device that might save them if they crashed. It was a proactive versus reactive mindset. Here's what most people don't realize.
The year 2000, the season right before Earnhardt died, was arguably the darkest warning sign the sport had ever received. In a span of just 5 months, NASCAR lost 3 drivers across its different series. Adam Petty, the 4th generation of the legendary Petty family, died in May. Kenny Irwin Jr. died in July. Tony Roper died in October. Now, you might be thinking, well, racing is dangerous. People die. But it wasn't just that they died. It was how they died. All 3 of them died from basilar skull fractures. All 3 hits looked survivable. All 3 drivers were not wearing a hands device. The Grim Reaper was practically shouting at the sport, pointing directly at the problem. But the culture of freak accidents prevailed. The prevailing narrative was just bad luck, a stuck throttle, a bad angle. Nobody wanted to admit that the cars had become lethal weapons to the human neck.
So when Earnhardt died in February 2001, the industry panicked. They had lost their king. The fans were grieving, but they were also angry. They wanted answers. And this is where the story gets incredibly messy and, frankly, shameful. In the immediate aftermath, NASCAR didn't come out and say, "We need head restraints." Instead, they held a press conference that directed the narrative toward a broken seatbelt. Let's pause here for a second because this is crucial. Investigators found that the left lap belt in Earnhardt's car had separated. It looked like it had been cut or torn. NASCAR officials suggested that if the belt hadn't broken, Dale's body wouldn't have moved forward as much, and he might have hit the steering wheel, but he wouldn't have suffered the fatal neck tension. They effectively pinned the blame on the equipment manufacturer, a company called Simpson Performance Products, run by Bill Simpson. Bill Simpson was a pioneer. He was the guy who set himself on fire in a fire suit to prove it worked. He was a racer's racer. And suddenly, he was being accused of killing Dale Earnhardt because of a defective belt. The fallout was horrific. Simpson received death threats, people were shooting at his house. He eventually resigned from his own company. It was a witch hunt. But here's the thing. Subsequent independent investigations, including a massive study by BioAdvisory and Associates, concluded that the belt failure was likely a result of the crash forces, not the cause of the death. And even if the belt had held, the outcome likely wouldn't have changed. Why? Because the belt holds the hips, it doesn't hold the head. If the hips are held tighter, the head snaps forward even faster relative to the torso. The belt theory was a red herring. It was a desperate attempt to find a mechanical scapegoat rather than facing the systemic biological reality. The real investigation, the one that actually mattered, took months. NASCAR hired outside experts, they simulated the crash, they used crash test dummies, they modeled the cockpit, and the data was undeniable. The peak G-force of the impact was around 55 to 60 Gs. The duration of the pulse, the time the crash forces were active, was about 0.1 seconds. In that window, without a hands device, the neck tension spiked to nearly 4,000 newtons. The human threshold for serious injury or death is somewhere around 2,500 to 2,200 newtons. Dale never had a chance. The math was brutal and absolute. This is where it gets really interesting for us engineering nerds. The hands device works on a principle of load transfer. It's not just a cushion. It creates a new load path. When you wear it, the yoke sits on your shoulders, held down by the seatbelts. Tethers connect the yoke to the helmet. In a crash, when your head moves forward, the tethers go taut. Instead of your neck taking the load, the tethers take the load, transfer it to the yoke, which transfers it to the seatbelts, and finally to the chassis. It bypasses the neck entirely. It keeps the head moving with the torso. In testing, the hands device reduced neck tension by up to 80%. It turned a 4,000 Newton fatal snap into an 800 Newton manageable jerk. The science was irrefutable, but science alone doesn't change culture. It takes leadership. And in the vacuum left by Earnhardt, the remaining drivers had to make a choice. Some, like Brett Bodine, had already started wearing the device after the 2000 deaths. Others were still skeptical. They complained about the collarbone pressure. They complained about not being able to turn their heads. But the tone in the garage had shifted. It was no longer a question of if you should wear it, but when you would be forced to. NASCAR, to their credit, didn't bury the final report.
In August 2001, 6 months after the crash, they released the findings. It was a massive document full of charts, graphs, and medical analysis. It exonerated Bill Simpson, though the damage to his reputation was done. It identified the basilar skull fracture as the cause of death, and it laid the groundwork for the most sweeping safety mandate in the history of the sport. But there was another piece of the puzzle that was just as important as the HAN device, and it had to do with the walls themselves. See, for 50 years, racetracks were lined with concrete. Concrete is great for buildings. It is terrible for stopping race cars. Concrete has zero give. When you hit it, it hits back with equal force. The idea of soft walls had been floated around for years, but track owners balked at the cost and the complexity. They said if you put foam on the walls, the cars will catch on fire, or it will bounce them back into traffic. These were excuses, but after February 18th, the excuses ran out. The University of Nebraska-Lincoln had been working on a project called the Safer Barrier, Steel and Foam Energy Reduction. And just like Dr. Hubbard's collar, it was sitting there, waiting for the sport to wake up. The Safer Barrier is honestly one of the most elegant solutions in modern engineering, because it solves a problem that seemed impossible. How do you soften a wall without making it act like a trampoline? See, before Safer, some tracks use tire barriers. You see these in Formula One all the time. Tires are great at absorbing energy, but they have a nasty habit of grabbing the car. Friction is high. When a stock car hits tires, it tends to snag, spin, or even flip. Or worse, the tires store the energy like a spring and shoot the car back across the track into oncoming traffic. NASCAR needed a wall that was smooth enough to slide along, but soft enough to crumple. Here's the thing about the Safer design. It's basically a false wall. You have the permanent concrete wall, and then about 30 inches in front of it, you mount square steel tubes stacked on top of each other. Sandwiched between the steel and the concrete are blocks of closed-cell foam. When a car hits the steel, the tubes bend, distributing the load across a wide area. Then the foam compresses, absorbing the kinetic energy. It's a giant track-sized crumple zone. The physics are simple. Force equals mass times acceleration. By extending the time it takes for the car to stop, even by a few hundred milliseconds, you drastically reduce the G-force spike. It turned 50 G impacts into 20 G impacts. It turned fatal crashes into catch-your-breath moments. Indianapolis Motor Speedway was the first to install it in 2002, and soon every major oval followed suit. But it cost millions. It was a massive infrastructure project, and without the pressure of the Earnhardt tragedy, it's unlikely track owners would have opened their wallets that fast. But while the walls were getting softer, the rules were getting harder. The 2001 season continued, and the tension was palpable. Drivers were experimenting with the HANS device, but it wasn't mandatory yet. Then, in October 2001, at a separate ARCA race at Charlotte, a young driver named Blaze Alexander was involved in a crash that was hauntingly similar to Earnhardt's. He hit the wall at a sharp angle. He wasn't wearing a head restraint. He suffered a basilar skull fracture and died. That was the final straw. NASCAR didn't wait for the offseason. They didn't wait for a committee. That same month, they mandated head and neck restraints for all top touring series. This was the watershed moment. The good old boy era of run what you brung and die like a man was officially over. If you wanted to race, you wore the collar. And sure, there was grumbling. Tony Stewart famously threw his HANS device across the garage at one point because it was uncomfortable. But they wore them, and the data started coming in immediately. Crashes that used to result in concussions and sore necks were resulting in nothing. Drivers were hopping out of the cars before the safety crews even got there. Now, you might be thinking, okay, they fixed the helmet, they fixed the wall. Job done, right? Wrong. The car itself was still a problem. Remember, the 2001 Monte Carlo was a rigid brick. NASCAR realized they needed to fundamentally redesign the chassis from the ground up to prioritize driver safety over speed or aesthetics. This project became known as the Car of Tomorrow, or COT. Debuting fully in 2007, the COT was frankly ugly. It looked like a box. It had a weird wing on the back instead of a spoiler. The drivers hated how it handled. Kyle Busch famously won the first race in a COT and said in the post-race interview, "It sucks." But while it was a disaster for drivability, it was a masterpiece of safety engineering. Here's what most people don't realize about the COT. The most important changes were the ones you couldn't see. They moved the driver's seat 4 inches closer to the center of the car. That doesn't sound like much, but in a side impact crash, a T-bone, 4 inches is a lifetime. It's 4 more inches of crush space before the intruding car hits the driver's ribcage. They also added energy-absorbing foam blocks inside the door panels. Impulse management again. They made the greenhouse, the roof area, taller and wider so that if the car flipped, the driver's head was nowhere near the roll bars. This era also saw the introduction of the containment seat. If you look at an old race from the 90s, the seats look like regular bucket seats. Maybe a little side support, but that's it. A containment seat looks like a cocoon. It has wraparound headrests made of carbon fiber and foam that practically lock the driver's helmet in place. Why? Because the hands device only works for forward motion. It doesn't help much if you get hit from the side. The containment seat stops your head from snapping sideways, preventing lateral neck injuries. So by 2010, you had this trifecta of safety: the hands device managing the head, the safer barrier managing the impact energy, and the containment seat/COT chassis managing the intrusion. It was a complete system, and for years, it worked perfectly. We went a decade without a fatality in the top 3 series. The fear started to fade. People started to forget why we had all this stuff. The danger of racing became an abstract concept again. But the universe has a way of testing your engineering just when you get comfortable. And the ultimate test came 19 years almost to the day of Earnhardt's death, the 2020 Daytona 500. Ryan Newman. If you watched that race, your heart stopped. It was the final lap. Newman was leading. He got turned, hit the wall, went airborne, flipped upside down, and then in a worst-case scenario was hit directly in the driver's side roof area by another car traveling at full speed. It was a violent, chaotic, terrifying crash. The car slid across the finish line on its roof, sparks showering everywhere, fluids leaking, flames erupting. It took the safety crew nearly 20 minutes to cut him out. They put a black screen so the fans couldn't see. The ambulance left slowly. The broadcast team was somber. We all thought, this is it. The streak is over. We lost one. But then, 2 days later, a photo was released. It showed Ryan Newman in a hospital gown holding the hands of his 2 daughters walking out of the hospital. He didn't have a broken bone. He had a brain bruise, a concussion, but he was alive. He was walking. This is where it gets emotional for anyone who understands the mechanics. Ryan Newman survived because of Dale Earnhardt. That's not a metaphor. Every single piece of technology that saved Newman's life that night can be traced directly back to the investigation into Earnhardt's death. Newman's hands device kept his neck from snapping when he hit the wall. The safer barrier absorbed the initial impact. The reinforced roll cage of the modern car, a descendant of the COT, prevented the roof from collapsing when he was struck by the other car. The containment seat kept his head from banging against the roll bars. It was a validation of 20 years of work. It proved that the freak accident isn't really a freak accident if you engineer for the outliers. It proved that you can crash a car at 200 miles per hour, get hit by another car, catch on fire, and still go home to your kids. But, and there is always a but in engineering, progress brings new problems. We solved the basilar skull fracture. We solved the acute trauma. But now we are facing a new invisible enemy. Because the cars and walls are so good at absorbing the big hits, drivers are taking more risks. They're blocking more aggressively. They're pushing harder. And while their bones aren't breaking, their brains are still sloshing around inside their skulls. We have entered the era of the concussion. The next-gen car, which debuted in 2022, is the safest car ever built on paper. It uses a composite body, independent rear suspension, and transaxles. It is a modern GT car disguised as a stock car. But early in its life, drivers started complaining. It hits too hard, they said. I feel it in my head. It turned out the car was too stiff. In the quest to make it durable, they had made it rigid again. We had inadvertently circled back to the problem of 2001, just at a higher level of sophistication. Drivers like Kurt Busch and Alex Bowman had to sit out races because of concussion-like symptoms from crashes that, visually, looked like nothing. NASCAR's response to the next-gen concussion issue was fascinating because it happened in real time. Unlike 2001, where change took months of agonizing debate, the response in 2022 and 2023 was data-driven and swift. They took the cars back to the crash facility in Ohio. They ran new simulations, and they found that the rear clip, the back section of the chassis, was indeed absorbing too much energy structurally rather than deforming. So they issued a redesign. They drilled holes in specific chassis rails. They removed material to intentionally weaken the structure. Think about that for a second. We spent 100 years trying to build stronger cars, and now the pinnacle of safety engineering is figuring out exactly where to make the car weak. It is a constant game of 4D chess against the laws of physics. This mindset, this willingness to tear apart a billion-dollar car design because a few drivers got headaches, is a direct legacy of February 2001. Before Earnhardt, a headache was just part of the job. After Earnhardt, a headache is a structural failure that requires an engineering overhaul. But here is where the story gets bigger than just stock cars turning left. The ripples of that crash in Daytona Beach crossed the Atlantic Ocean and fundamentally changed the landscape of global motorsport. Formula One, the self-proclaimed pinnacle of technological racing, was watching. Now, Formula One has always been a different beast. Open wheels, open cockpits, carbon fiber monocoques, but they had the same problem: the human neck. When the hands device was first introduced to the F1 grid, the resistance was even fiercer than in NASCAR. These were European drivers who prided themselves on neck strength. They trained their necks like bodybuilders train their biceps. To them, a plastic collar was an insult. It was American safety overkill. But the FIA, the governing body, looked at the data coming out of the Earnhardt investigation. They looked at their own accidents. And in 2003, they made it mandatory. It didn't stop there. The safety-first culture that started with the hands device eventually led to the development of the Halo. You've probably seen it, that titanium wishbone bar that sits over the cockpit of modern F1 cars. When it was introduced in 2018, the backlash was identical to the hands backlash. It's ugly. It ruins the DNA of the sport. If you're scared, don't race. The comments section on every F1 video was a dumpster fire of hate for the Halo. Then came the 2020 Bahrain Grand Prix. Romain Grosjean. Grosjean's car pierced a steel barrier at 120 miles per hour, split in half, and exploded into a fireball. It was arguably the most violent crash in modern F1 history. When the car went through the barrier, the Halo acted as a shield, prying the metal rails apart and protecting Grosjean's head. Without it, he would have been decapitated, plain and simple. He climbed out of the fire with burns on his hands, but he was alive. The narrative flipped instantly. The ugly bar was now a halo in the literal sense. Just like with the hands device, the aesthetics ceased to matter the moment a life was saved. The ghost of the Earnhardt tragedy is present in that survival too, because it was the moment the world decided that tradition is not a valid reason to let people die. Now, let's bring it back down to earth. We've talked about billion-dollar organizations and millionaire drivers, but what about the Saturday night racer? What about the guy working a 9-to-5 who tows a beat-up street stock to the local dirt track on the weekends? Here's the thing that is hard to swallow. Safety is expensive. A top-tier carbon fiber helmet costs $3,000. A Hans device costs $600 to $1,000. A custom containment seat can cost $4,000. For a local racer, that's an entire engine rebuild. That's a season's worth of tires. For years after 2001, there was a dangerous gap. The pros were safe, but the amateurs were still dying. Local tracks didn't have the money for safer barriers. Local drivers didn't want to spend the money on Hans devices. But slowly, the culture trickled down. It started with the youth. Parents who watched Earnhardt die weren't going to let their kids get into a go-kart without a neck collar. Quarter midget associations, Bandolero series, legend cars, they all started mandating head and neck restraints for the kids. Those kids grew up. They are today's racers. To them, putting on a Hans device is as natural as putting on socks. They don't know a world without it. They don't have the tough guy complex about safety gear because they've never been socialized to view safety as weakness. This generational shift is the true victory. You go to a local short track now and you see Hans devices everywhere. You see containment seats in cars that look like they were pulled out of a junkyard. The democratization of safety technology means that a 19-year-old kid in a hobby stock has a better chance of surviving a crash today than a Formula One world champion did in 1990. However, we need to address a paradox that has emerged from all this. It's a concept in psychology called risk compensation. The theory is that when people feel safer, they act more dangerously. If you give a skydiver a backup parachute, they might try a riskier jump. If you give a driver a car that is virtually indestructible, how do they drive? Watch a NASCAR race from 1995. The drivers give each other room. They respect the danger. If you touch wheels at 190 miles per hour, you both might die. There was a self-regulating code of conduct born from the fear of death. Now, watch a race from 2025. They slam into each other. They use the bumper as a brake. They throw blocks that would be considered suicidal 30 years ago. Why? Because the fear is gone. Is this good for racing? That's a debate for the fans. But from an engineering standpoint, it is a testament to the success of the systems. The fact that drivers can drive like absolute maniacs without a death wish is proof that the physics have been conquered. But it also creates a new responsibility. We have to protect the drivers from themselves. If the fear of death no longer regulates the sport, then the rulebook and the chassis design have to do the heavy lifting. This is where it gets really interesting for the future. The next frontier isn't just surviving the crash, it's predicting it. We are entering the age of active safety. Telemetry is now so advanced that teams know a part is failing before it fails. We are seeing the integration of AI into crash analysis. There is talk of active cockpit safety systems, airbags that deploy based on predictive algorithms, seatbelts that pre-tension milliseconds before impact because the car's computer knows a crash is inevitable. Imagine a world where the car detects a slide that is unrecoverable. Before the driver even processes that they are crashing, the car has already tightened the belts, deployed the side curtain airbags, which are being tested, and adjusted the suspension stiffness to absorb the blow. It sounds like science fiction, but so did a head and neck support in 1980.
Dale Earnhardt was a man of the analog age. He drove by feel. He tuned the car with a wrench and a hammer. He died right at the precipice of the digital revolution. And in a poetic sense, his death was the bridge between the two. He was the last casualty of the old world and the catalyst for the new one. But we cannot talk about his legacy without talking about the fans, the people in the stands, you, me. For a long time, there was a morbid curiosity in racing. People claim they watched for the passing, but deep down, a part of the human brain watches for the spectacle of danger. The big one at Talladega, the massive pileup. February 18, 2001 changed us too. It took the fun out of the crash. When we saw the number 3 car hit the wall and we realized the outcome, the innocence was lost. We realize that these aren't gladiators made of stone. They are fathers, sons, fragile biological machines strapped into metal missiles. The way we consume the sport changed. We hold our breath differently now. When a car goes airborne, the cheer is different. It's not a bloodthirsty roar. It's a gasp of concern. And when the driver lowers the window net, that universal sign of "I'm okay," the applause is genuine relief. We demanded better. The fans put pressure on NASCAR just as much as the media did. If NASCAR had tried to sweep the safety issues under the rug, the fan base would have revolted. We voted with our wallets. We supported the safety initiatives. We accepted the ugly cars and the confusing rules because we understood the cost of the alternative. So as we look at the modern landscape of motorsports, from the high-tech hybrids of Le Mans to the dirt midgets of Indiana, we see the fingerprint of the intimidator everywhere. Not in the aggressive driving, though that's there too, but in the carbon fiber collars, the foam walls, the headrests, the very philosophy that says, we can go fast, but we must go home.
It is strange to think that there is an entire generation of adults now who never saw Dale Earnhardt race. To them, he is a logo on a t-shirt, a vintage jacket, or a clip on YouTube. They know the legend, but they didn't feel the presence. They didn't feel the way the air changed in the room when he walked in. But every time they watch a race today, they are watching his influence in motion. This brings us to the final and perhaps most poignant realization of this entire saga. There is a concept in engineering called the Tombstone Mentality. It's a grim term used in aviation and industrial safety. It basically means that safety regulations are written in blood. Agencies and organizations often wait until a disaster happens, until they are tombstones, before they fix a known problem. It is reactive, not proactive. The Titanic gave us lifeboat regulations. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire gave us fire codes. And Dale Earnhardt gave us modern racing safety. It is a damning indictment of human nature that we require a sacrifice of that magnitude to do what is logically necessary. We knew the physics, we knew the biology, we had the hardware, but we lacked the will. It took the death of the one man who seemed unkillable to break the tombstone mentality in motorsports. It forced the sport to grow up overnight. It forced a billion-dollar industry to look in the mirror and admit that its traditions were killing its heroes. So when we look back at the 2001 Daytona 500, we shouldn't just see it as a tragedy. We should see it as the most pivotal moment in the history of the automobile. Think about how much technology transfers from the track to the street. The crash structures in your family sedan, the way your seatbelt pretensions, the crumple zones. A lot of that data comes from the high-speed laboratories of the racetrack. By making race cars safer, we eventually make all cars safer. The data gathered from the Hans device development has influenced helmet design in the military and in football. The study of traumatic brain injuries in racing has contributed to our understanding of concussions in all contact sports. The ripple effect is endless. If Dale Earnhardt had just retired, if he had finished third that day, gone home, and spent his twilight years fishing on his farm, he would still be a legend. He would be the 7-time champion, the intimidator. But because of what happened in turn 4, he became something more. He became a savior. It is a title he never asked for, and one he probably would have hated. He didn't want to be a martyr, he just wanted to win the race. But history doesn't ask for permission. There is a statue of him outside Daytona International Speedway. It's bronze. He's holding the trophy, smiling that mischievous Earnhardt smile. Fans leave pennies on it, they leave flowers. But the real monument isn't the statue. The real monument is Ryan Newman walking out of the hospital. The real monument is the driver who hits the wall at 180 miles per hour tonight, curses on the radio, and climbs out to wave at the crowd. Every time a driver walks away, that is the number 3 car crossing the finish line one more time. I want to leave you with this thought. We often look for heroes in the wrong places. We look for the guy who wins the most, the guy who drives the fastest, the guy who is the toughest. But sometimes, the greatest contribution a person makes is not in their triumphs, but in the lessons left behind in their absence. Dale Earnhardt changed the world not by winning his 8th championship, but by losing his life in a way that made it impossible for us to look away. He forced us to choose between our nostalgia and our humanity, and for once, we made the right choice. This has been a deep dive into the engineering and the ethics of the most significant crash in racing history. It's a heavy topic, I know, but it's one that deserves to be understood not just as a sports story, but as a story about the intersection of physics, psychology, and progress. We analyzed the vectors, the g-forces, the biology, and the sociology. We looked at the mechanics of the HANS device and the structural brilliance of the safer barrier. Hopefully, the next time you see a race, you'll look past the paint schemes and the sponsors, and you'll see the incredible web of technology that is working silently, invisibly, to keep those drivers alive. If you are still here, thank you. This is the kind of storytelling we are building here at Legacy Motoring. We don't just skim the surface, we tear the engine apart to see how it works. If you learned something new today, whether it was about basilar skull fractures, the impulse momentum theorem, or just the history of NASCAR, please consider subscribing. It really does help the channel grow and allows me to spend way too much time researching 25-year-old technical reports. Drop a comment below and let me know. Do you think the active safety future of AI-controlled crash avoidance is a good thing, or are we making the cars too safe, taking the human element out of the risk? I read every comment, and I'm genuinely curious where you stand on the line between safety and spectacle. Also, if there is another engineering mystery or automotive legend you want us to break down, maybe the Group B rally era, or the Ford Pinto fuel tank controversy, or the aerodynamics of the Le Mans flips, let me know. We are just getting started. Until next time, keep your belts tight, respect the physics, and remember that sometimes the most important victories are the ones that happen after the race is over. This is Legacy Motoring, signing off.